So now we're ready for our second set of notes for this unit, the politics of the 1920s. So in our last lecture, we talked about the society and how it was going through all of these changes, so the social, cultural, economic part of America. And so the purpose of these notes, which will be done in 3 parts, is to talk about the political landscape of America in the 1920s. And in many ways, as we can see by this picture, the 1920s is, like I've said before, a return to the Gilded Age. We're going to have a lot, it's going to be very pro-big business, and we're going to have a lot of corruption in politics. As you can see by this political cartoon, it looks like the United States government is for sale, going off to big businesses. The other thing we're going to see is that Republicans are going to dominate the 1920s. Wilson and the Democrats were associated with progressivism, and that time is over. And so we're going to now swing back to, just like in the Gilded Age, a time of several Republican presidents in a row. And the Republican presidents promised the American voters a quote-unquote return to normalcy, which means that we're not going to do any more progressive crusades or reforms. We're not going to get involved in any other future wars and try to remake society. We're just going to get back to the business of America, which is making money. So we have our first president of the 1920s, Warren G. Harding. Warren G. Harding is a Republican. He is very pro-business, as we will see. He is going to try to turn back the clock back to the Gilded Age so we can go to the very pro-business stance the United States government had then. So the first thing he's going to do is he's going to have 4 different Supreme Court justices' appointment come up in his administration, and he's going to appoint conservative justices, which in the 1920s means pro-business justices. And we can see that there'll be a whole series of cases which will overturn a lot of the progressive legislation we saw in the last time period. For example, we are going to put an end to laws that were banning child labor. Now, once again, we can see children be employed again back in business because this is good for business. They have cheaper workers. They have little tiny hands, little tiny feet. Kids can get into mine shafts and factory places that adults can't. And so we're going to see this business is going to like this. And so we're going to kind of turn back the clock to go back to the days of the Gilded Age where we had more child labor. In addition to that, just like in the Gilded Age, the court system is going to once again use the injunction to break up strikes and unions, just like we did back between 1865 and 1900. And if you remember, back in the Progressive Age, progressives thought that women should not be working in factories, and so we had the Supreme Court case of Mueller versus Oregon. But in the 1920s, this conservative Supreme Court is going to overturn Mueller versus Oregon and Adkins versus Children's Hospital, and says that once again, women and children can be employed in dangerous working conditions because it's good for business. Women and children get paid less than male workers do, and so that helps raise profits. And they say that the government doesn't have the right to regulate the economy and tell businesses who to hire or who not to hire. So let's talk about Harding in business. The last was all about Harding in the court system. So next we have Harding in business, and as his person in charge of his tax policy, we have Secretary of the Treasury Andrew Mellon. Andrew Mellon is going to set tax policy for the United States under Harding, and it's going to be, again, very leaning towards the upper class. In the Progressive Age, we had the income tax, and so the upper classes of society, we had to pay as much as 65% of their income into the income tax. And the purpose of that, if you remember, was to shrink the wealth gap between the wealthiest Americans and the middle class. Well, Andrew Mellon, very pro-business, very pro-elite, he says this is not something that's good for America, and so he's going to drop the income tax from a very high 65% down to 20%. The reason he does this is because he believes it's going to stimulate the economy. If the government lowers the taxes on the richest Americans, it means that those rich people now have more money in their pocket. The government isn't taking money away from them, and so these rich people, in theory, have more money to invest in stocks, which is going to generate more business, and also buy luxury items, yachts, mansions, what have you. And so that's going to it's going to kind of trickle down and put more people back to work. And so they say, Andrew Mellon and the Republicans believe at this time that if we cut taxes on the rich, it'll stimulate the economy because, again, the rich will go and invest and buy, and that will put more of the common people back to work. And so this is his tax policy of the 1920s. And in the short term, it works very well. We see the economy, as we've seen before, roaring. We see the economy doing very well. But there are some long-term unforeseen costs of this. Some historians or economists business have said that this may be a cause of the Great Depression that will come later, is it's going to shift the tax burden from the upper class to the middle and lower classes. In other words, who's going to be paying most of the taxes? It's going to be the middle and lower, because we just lowered taxes on the upper class. Now, this is a problem because even though upper class people do consume, they do buy lots of luxury items, they don't consume in near the numbers that the middle and lower classes do. Even if we have one millionaire who spends thousands of dollars on consumer items, he's nowhere come near to the thousands and thousands of middle class and lower class people who are buying goods. And so as they continue to be taxed, the middle and lower class, the 1920s rolls on, and as the middle and lower class has the tax burden, that's going to mean that they have less money in their pockets, and eventually around 1929, they just run out of money. They don't have as much money as they used to because they've been paying all these taxes to continue to buy luxury items or to continue to buy consumer goods. And so when the middle class runs out of money, we're going to see that's a major problem for the U.S. economy. Next, Harding and Business continued. We see that if you remember, back in the Gilded Age, tariffs were high. It helps American industry. If you force Americans to pay high tariffs on foreign goods, that means that they're going to, by extension, then buy American-made goods. So it forces American consumers to buy goods made in America, which is good for American corporations. And so we see the very high Fordney-McCumber tariff. And this is going to raise tariff rates again. In the progressive wage, we had lowered them with the Underwood tariff. Now we are going to raise tariff rates again, and this is going to be very beneficial to big business. But here again, we're going to have some consequences later on. Europe is just trying to recover from the economic hardship that is World War I, and to do that, they have to sell goods to American consumers. But they can't do that anymore because they hit this tariff wall. And so Europe is going to still have a tough time economically, certainly Germany is, as they try to recover from paying for all those war reparations and paying for the cost of the war. And so we're going to see that this has a negative impact on Europe, which will create some conditions that we'll talk about in the 1930s that will drive Europe into conflict. The other thing this does is it's going to hurt American middle-class consumers, just like Mellon's tax policies perhaps did. Now we're going to see that American middle-class consumers, not only are they paying high taxes, but those middle-class consumers are now paying more for their consumer goods because if European prices go up because of the tariff, then American companies are going to raise their prices just underneath the tariff line. So overall, consumer prices go up, and eventually the good times can't last. American consumers, middle-class consumers, will start to run out of money in the end of the 20s. Next, Harding and corruption. So again, we see how many times we can say this, that the 1920s is going to mirror the Gilded Age. Just like the Gilded Age and the Grant administration was known for corruption in the federal government, so is the Harding administration. So we'll give you a couple examples of that. First of all, the Attorney General of the United States, Attorney General Doherty, during World War I, the United States had seized German assets. In other words, if you were a German and you had invested in America, when we went to war with Germany, we don't want Germany to get rich off of their American investments while we're fighting them, and so we froze or seized their assets, which means during the course of the war, all of that German money that was invested in America is going to be held by the United States government until we see fit that we can then release it and give it back to the Germans. And so this is supposed to be held in trust. We're just supposed to be holding on to it, not using it. But the Attorney General decides that he's going to use some of this money for himself and his cronies, and so they get personally rich off of this, which of course is breaking the law, and they shouldn't do, and this gets found out. Next, we see the Veterans Bureau. The Veterans Bureau has been in the news a lot lately as well, but we see that the Veterans Bureau of the United States, for all of those vets that have come back, the United States government is supposed to put money into hospitals and medical treatment for our veterans so they can recover from whatever injuries they accumulated during World War I. But that money that was supposed to be going to the Veterans Bureau is instead going to line the pockets of the people in charge of the Veterans Bureau. And so instead of giving $10,000 to buy some medicine, the head of the Veterans Bureau will just use that $10,000 to take a vacation or to make himself richer. Obviously not something you're supposed to do. This also gets out, and we're going to find out that people are going to be very mad at the United States government for this. And then the biggest scandal of all in the Harding administration is something called the Teapot Dome scandal. So it's kind of an involved story, but before we get into it, it's just another example of the Harding administration's corruption. So the Secretary of the Interior, the person in charge of America's resources and lands, his name is Albert Fall. And what happens is that we have big oil reserves in the United States, and we save them in case of a war. We want our Navy and our Army to have the oil they need for the machines and for production. And that oil was kept in the ground at a place called the Teapot Dome oil reserve. There was a big chunk of oil sitting in the ground waiting there for the United States government in case of war. And it was called the Teapot Dome Oil Reserve. Well, that oil reserve was being controlled by the Navy Department, and Secretary of Interior Albert Fall, he transfers control of that oil reserve from the Navy Department to his own Interior Department. The reason he does this is because now he goes to oil companies and says, "Look, I've got all this oil just sitting there. Who wants to drill it out of the ground?" And so several oil companies try to convince him to let their company drill the oil out of the ground. And so they start bribing the Secretary of Interior, Albert Fall, pick our company, and eventually he picks the company that will give him personally the most money. So he takes bribes for these oil leases or the right to drill oil. Now, all of these scandals are going to be kept hush-hush until actually the Harding administration is over. Warren G. Harding is going to die while in office. He was elected in 1920. And as soon as he dies, just because of timing, the press is going to find out about these stories, and it's going to put a taint and certainly a bad impression of the people of the Harding administration. But this all happens after Harding dies. So during his time in office, he was actually very popular, especially with big business. But once he's dead, people find out about all of these scandals, and they get very upset, and they think that Washington is certainly very corrupt. So it's an example of the Gilded Age again. So the last thing we're going to have on Harding is his foreign policy. If you remember, this is right after World War II. Americans don't want to get involved in any other foreign wars after World War I. We don't want to get in any other foreign wars. And so Americans are in the mood to be isolationists. We don't want to get in any other wars. We don't want to get drawn into any other conflicts. And so Harding's foreign policy is going to be very isolationist, with one big exception: if it helps American businesses. So let's give you some examples of that. In 1922, the Harding administration convinces the United States Senate to sign the Nine-Power Naval Treaty, which basically says that the United States is now going to have access to some Chinese ports. It finally gives us what we've been wanting for a long time, an open door into China. And so now we are going to be trading with China and dealing with other European countries in our efforts to trade with China. So that doesn't sound very isolationist, and it's not, but remember the exception is that this is going to help business. American companies can now sell their goods to Chinese markets. And so we see this as a great example of isolationism, unless, of course, it helps business. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to reduce the size of the Army and the Navy. Why do we need it? We're not going to be involved in any of their wars, and so the United States government is going to scale back the size of the United States Navy and United States Army. This will also have the benefit of allowing the United States government to lower tax rates. If we don't have an army to pay for, we don't have to have high taxes. So this certainly is going to keep us out of future wars if we don't have any military, and it's also going to help business and rich people in America because we don't have to pay taxes to support our large military. Then the final thing we have is we have the Washington Conference. The Washington Conference is a conference that's in Washington, D.C., and three major nations come to the conference. It's the United States, the British, the UK, and Japan. And the purpose of this conference is to reduce armaments, reduce the Navy. And so before World War I, there was a craze to build battleships. England was building battleships, so Germany had to build battleships, so America had to build battleships, and it was kind of an arms race. Everybody has to keep up with the other major powers in the world, and we want to reduce the military and not get involved in any more conflicts. So these three nations come together, and they decide to not build any more battleships for 10 years. That's going to help us reduce our costs. In addition to that, after that 10 years, what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that we have a 5-5-3 ratio. In other words, for every 5 battleships the United States has, the British can have 5 and the Japanese can have 3. And so we see that everybody's going to be reducing their armaments because nobody wants to go to another war again after World War I. On the left-hand side, we see this as an example. We have the United States has 18 battleships with a total tonnage of 525,000 pounds. The same with the British. They have 22 battleships, but they're slightly smaller, and then the Japanese have less, so forth and so on. And so we're seeing that the world is trying to scale down a little bit. The theory goes, if we don't have weapons, we won't go to another war, plus we can lower taxes. And so that's it for the Harding administration. When we come back, we'll talk about the Coolidge administration, which is a much different, in many ways, administration than what we saw under Harding.